Hey IDC Church family, Pastor Shane here. Wanted to do a quick video to answer a question that I'm sure many of you are wondering. Some of you guys have even asked us, and that is the question, what are we going to do about the Lord's Supper during this time when we're not able to do our normal corporate gatherings? And that's a good question for multiple reasons, but one of them is just it's been the pattern of our church to take the Lord's Supper weekly. It's been one of our convictions really from the day the church was planted, that we wanted to take the Lord's Supper weekly as a church body. And now we find ourselves in a position where we can't actually get together to worship, to sit under the Word, and to take the Lord's Supper. And so everybody's reasonably asking, how does it look like what does it look like to think about taking the Lord's Supper together? So the pastors have gotten together, not actually, but digitally, and tried to think through the options, tried to consider the pros and cons of different options, and we've come to the conclusion that we are going to hold off on leading our church to take the Lord's Supper until we can get together again for corporate worship. That we're not going to try to lead the church to take the Lord's Supper in our really scattered state, but instead to wait until we can gather together as a church. Now, there's some details about what that might look like that we just don't have access to right now. We don't know how long the shutdown is going to go, when it opens back up, or larger group gathering is going to be allowed. There's some uncertainty there, but the bottom line is we think it would be best for us to wait until we can gather together for worship to take the Lord's Supper together. So that's where we landed. Let me tell you how we got there. We considered multiple different options. And there's different ways that churches are thinking about the Lord's Supper. I just want to run through them real quickly. I've color-coded them for you to make it, you can visually kind of see how we thought through these. The first option might be that individuals or families just in their home right now take the Lord's Supper. Maybe whoever's leading the service can lead everybody digitally to take the Lord's Supper. Just go find some elements and let's take it online. That is one option. We are not going with that option. Another option would be, what if small groups could get together? Maybe they could, on Tuesday night, if groups of 15 or 20 could get together, maybe a small group on Tuesday night or Wednesday night or whatever could take the Lord's Supper when they gather at their normal times. Again, we don't think that's the best option. Another one that's slightly different is small groups taking them together, but what if they were gathering on Sunday morning? So we were all watching a live stream, but we were doing that as small groups in homes. Should small groups take the Lord's Supper? And you say, all those are red. We don't think that's the best way for our church to pursue faithfulness to the Scriptures during this time. There's two more options, and you'll see they're turning green here. So one would be, what if we could get together in larger groups that are still size limited, maybe 100, 150, 200 or something like that, and we just had more worship services. If a group of 100 could get together, what if we had 8, 9 services of IDC gathering together? Should we serve the Lord's Supper then? And that would at least be consistent with our practice now when the church is gathering together for corporate worship. It would just be a lot of services. There's multiple reasons that that is not ideal, and we'll see if something like that happens, but we're not necessarily jumping at that opportunity or hope. The thing that seems most likely and we would obviously be most comfortable with is, let's hold off until we can return to our regular corporate worship gatherings when the church family can gather together again, sit under the Word, sing together, and take the Lord's Supper. So that's kind of where we landed as far as what we're most comfortable with. Let me give you the reasons for that. There's really 3 reasons. And I just want to run through them real quickly. The first reason is biblical, which is always a good place to start when you're trying to reason what faithfulness looks like. The biblical reason is really grounded in one chapter. You could go more places, but there's this one chapter in 1 Corinthians, chapter 11, where the Apostle Paul is giving instructions to the Corinthians, and he's correcting their understanding and their practice of the Lord's Supper. And one phrase that keeps popping out is this phrase, when you come together. And it seems to be no less than 5 times does he say this, when you come together, and then he talks about the Lord's Supper. And it seems to be that the Apostle Paul understood the Lord's Supper to be something that was for the church gathered together for their corporate worship time. I don't think this coming together is just like seeing somebody in the marketplace and like, hey, let's stop and let's go to the side and take the Lord's Supper together. Instead, what he seems to be saying is this is the gathering of the church for worship. And so when you do that, here's how you ought to consider and practice the Lord's Supper. And that has implications for how we think about the Lord's Supper more broadly. There might be lots of opportunities to commemorate some kind of spiritually meaningful time or experience or fellowship. And sometimes our minds go, should we take the Lord's Supper now? Would this be a good time to take the Lord's Supper? But the problem with that is it tends to assume that the Lord's Supper is primarily given to the Christian. This is something that is given to the Christian to practice and observe, to remember Jesus and what he did, his work on the cross, his death, on our behalf. But going back to that passage in 1 Corinthians 11, it seems that Paul thought that the Lord's Supper wasn't just given to the Christian, but it was given to the church. The Lord's Supper is something for the church. And so there are all kinds of times when we as individual or small groups of Christians could do something like the Lord's Supper. But the question is that what this is meant for? And we don't think that smaller gatherings, maybe at a camp or at a wedding or at a kind of a spiritually meaningful pilgrimage or something like that, those are not the best times to do something like the Lord's Supper, because the Lord's Supper isn't really meant for those times. Instead, it's meant for the church when it gathers together for worship. And so there's this biblical precedent that seems to assume this is meant for the corporate gathering of the church body. Another reason might be something like what we call devotional. And this is basically grounded in the reality that the Lord's Supper is extremely important, but it is not ultimate. We can still follow Jesus during this time, but we've lost something really, really important. And the question is, how do we respond to that? One option would be to say, let's find a way to do something like the Lord's Supper. But another option, and I think an equally biblical, maybe a more biblical option, would be to say, this time when we can't actually gather together for the Lord's Supper should draw our hearts to lament, to cry out to God and ask that he would make this whole thing go away, that death and dying and sickness would stop because of the coronavirus, that it would stop wreaking havoc, and that instead of just trying to find a way to do the Lord's Supper, instead we would respond to this time when we can't by crying out to God, by prayer and fasting. Those are biblical responses to tragedy and trial in this life. And it is a good thing for us to meditate on the loss that is going on right now. And one way that's really going to bring that loss and that devastation home is this important, hugely important thing that we actually just can't do together during this time. And a third reason you might call philosophical. It's just a general concern we have that our impulse, I'm just talking collectively, culturally, and within the church as well, our general impulse is to say, how can we do this digitally? There's a lot of energy to say, how can we take these things that the church is supposed to be and do them on the internet? Now, the internet's a great thing, but I do think we need to be cautious, and the elders have talked about this a lot. We want to be careful to say that we can do these things that really require our embodied presence, our actual physically being together, and think that we can do those kind of with some kind of digital approximation or replacement. That's more of a vague guideline, but it is a concern that we have, that we are meant to live the Christian life together, and there's a limitation to what we can do online. And we don't want to just pretend that we can easily transfer something like the Lord's Supper and just do that digitally. And so instead, what we're going to say is, no, this is really grounded in us being together. And because of that, let's hold on to that, and let's long for the day that we can worship together again. And so those are kind of a quick rundown of the reasons. I think that leaves us all in a place where we're looking forward to gathering for worship. We're longing for that time. I agree with what many of you guys have said. Those first worship gatherings where we can come back together as a church are going to be so sweet. And I think one of the reasons they're going to be so sweet is because after having a fairly long season where we could not take the table together, we will once again be able to break bread and take the cup and take the bread and remember together what Christ has done for us. And so rather than trying to just make that happen in some kind of approximate way right now, we're going to keep looking forward to that. And I look forward to doing that with you guys as a church family. So thank you guys for thinking about this biblically and deeply and intentionally. And accordingly, let's just walk in what we think the scriptures are saying. This is, again, how the elders have agreed. And we think that this is the best way to lead this church to follow Jesus during this time. Thanks, guys.